Hello and welcome to the Rejuvenate podcast. I'm your host, Chrissy Hawks, and I'm here with my co-host, Elwin Robinson, the creator and founder of Genetic Insights and the author of the Rejuvenate Blueprint. Lovely listeners, as always, thank you for leaving those comments. Keep them coming. We really do appreciate them. And you guys are leaving some intriguing things there, so keep it up. Today, we are going to discuss what Elwin believes is the real cause behind the chronic health epidemic that no one else is talking about. So, Elwin, I cannot wait to get into this because there's a lot of stuff going on in the health industry that, yeah, you're right. Nobody is talking about these other things that are here. So I really want to find out from you, what do you believe is causing this chronic health epidemic?
Yeah, and in terms of the kind of root causes on an individual level, I think I've already covered that reasonably well in the Rejuvenate Blueprint. But I wanted to discuss in this episode more what's actually causing it, like in the world in general, because it's a topic of a lot of conversation at the moment. Actually, for the first time, it's starting to be on mainstream news, mainstream politicians. We won't get into all that because that's like a news thing that we do on the news show. Check that out if you haven't seen that. But what I wanted to address is I actually think that the main cause of the chronic health epidemic is actually a uh, error in thinking.
Okay. And Aaron, thinking just like mainstream or just kind of how we've gone down with theories?
Yeah, so an error in thinking, definitely in the mainstream, but then to some degree as a reaction in the alternative world as well. And so I'm gonna, I know this may not make sense to you yet, so bear with me. I'm going to explain why this is the case, what the error in thinking is, how we can start to actually think about it in a bit more of a rational way, where I think some people are still going wrong on both sides. So both in terms of the mainstream, but then also in the alternative, and what I think would actually be a more helpful way of looking at things going forward that would truly help to resolve this chronic health epidemic that almost everyone's afflicted with. If you're one of the lucky few who is not personally afflicted with it, there's very likely that a loved one is. And also, even if you already understand a lot of what I'm going to say in this episode, what I hope to equip you with as well is tools for how to explain this to other people in your life who may not understand it, who may be under the spell of either the mainstream perspective or perhaps under the spell of one of the very opposite alternative perspectives, to help them get to a little bit more of a rational, reasonable, less extreme position that will help them. So, to explain what I mean about an extreme position, I actually wanted to start with something I think at one point we were planning to do a whole episode on, Chrissy, but in the end, I feel like I don't know enough about it to do that, and that's okay. So I just wanted to read a few snippets about this particular approach that we can then discuss and to make people aware of, and then to use that to make a point, which I hope will be valuable for you as the listener. So I came across a few months ago this thing called the Primal Diet by, and I don't know how to say the first name correctly, but I think it's Aajonus and Vonderplanitz. And I think that's actually not his real name anyway. So who knows? But
It's a
yes.
mouthful, God bless him.
And so just to distinguish this is not the primal diet from, I think, Mark Sisson, like the more well-known primal, as in like paleo diet. This is a very specific diet that you don't see talked about that much, but actually I would say it has had a bit of an impact on the alternative health culture. And some people who are very well-known health influencers, they do talk about the precepts of it, even if they don't, necessarily acknowledge this person or his system by name. So basically what I'm saying is you've probably come across people who have been talking about some of the precepts of it, even if you've never actually heard of him. So I'm just going to read a few snippets from this great account on X called The Primal Diet by Aajonus Primal Diet. Very simple. That does a good job, I think, of just breaking stuff down into bite-sized chunks. And so, yeah, let me get into it. All right. So the first thing to understand about this perspective, and this goes back to really the root of modern medicine, is that there are two fundamental schools of thought about what causes disease. There is the pathogen or infection theory, and then there is terrain theory. You're nodding head, Chrissy. You're familiar with
Yeah,
those?
yeah, we've discussed it before as well, just understanding like, yeah, what is it something that's in, that I'm touching, that I'm bringing in, or is it actually my environment that's really causing the issue there?
Yeah, that is the crux of it. And so this was, an argument just over 100 years ago between Pasteur and Beauchamp, who were two, I don't know, influencers of their day. Um, and so Pasteur believed, so this was not that long after the discovery and classification of microscopic organisms. I guess that's the point. If you'd have said 200 years ago that there are these tiny, tiny little creatures that you can't see that are making you ill, that would be, considered less credible than it's, an affliction of demons from Satan. Like literally, that would be considered like a crazy idea by most people. Um, and yet, these organisms were discovered. They were discovered to show up alongside disease. And so the understandable and, in my opinion, not incorrect conclusion was made that they can and do cause disease. And so what am I talking about? In case anyone's not 100% with me, I'm talking about bacteria, I'm talking about parasites, I'm talking about yeasts and fungi and molds and viruses and protozoa and all kinds of other these organisms that you need a microscope to be able to see, that from a, again, mainstream perspective, they are attacking the body, and the immune system has to fight them off. And if the immune system is successful, then we get better. And if the immune system is not, then we die, or perhaps depending on the type of infection, we suffer. So that is the perspective that the pathogen infection model of disease believes. And again, I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm trying to speak in fairly neutral terms about all of this until I give my opinion at the end. And so, but there is another school of thought, which is the terrain theory, which initially was also very popular, although it thoroughly lost from any kind of mainstream perspective eventually. And that's that what matters, as you said, Christy, is the terrain going on inside you. So the evidence of this is that although there are some pathogens that are very virulent, like meaning they're very likely to infect you and quote unquote make you sick, there is no pathogen that I'm aware of that has 100% rate of making you sick. Like even the most extreme ones, there are people who are resistant or immune to them, to use the mainstream language. And so that brings up, you don't have to not believe in pathogens. You don't have to not believe that they make you sick to still believe that if you are strong enough, if you are healthy enough, if your immune system is strong enough, then you can potentially be fine. So there could be another way of looking at it, saying it's not that these organisms make you sick, it's that your lack of immunity, your lack of resistance is the thing that makes you sick. The organism is just there, and it's up to you whether you can handle them or not. So that's a very, to go into psychology and kind of stuff for a second. There's different schools of thought in that regard, right? There's kind of a victim consciousness element of psychology where everything that happens is someone else's fault, right? And then there's a kind of extreme personal responsibility aspect of psychology where it's like, everything is my responsibility, because even though I can't control the outside world and what happens, I can always control how I respond to it, right? So those are two different schools of thought. And I read an interesting book recently about this. So narcissists, people with narcissistic personality disorder, famously tend to externalize blame, to use the psychological language. It's always someone else's fault when things go wrong. But I read a interesting book. God, I can't remember the name of it.
I was going to say, I'm going to ask what the name of the book is, so I can put that in the description below and probably read it myself.
Well, it brought up this idea that there's an opposite of a narcissist that's also unhealthy, which they call an echo type. And so this is because from the original myth of Narcissus, Narcissus was, partnered with Echo. I'm a bit vague on this. I wasn't planning to talk about this, but basically, so the narcissist is extreme. Look at me. I'm important, and not taking responsibility. And Echo type is the exact opposite. They tend to not want attention. They tend to not want people to look at them. They tend to not want to take credit. They tend to have a strong sense of taking personal responsibility. And so in many ways, often they are, you know, desirable people to be around, but it can be extreme. There can be an extreme, always taking responsibility for everything, even if it isn't your fault. Never speaking up and saying what is on your mind, even if your idea is better than the people around you. Shunning attention even when you deserve it. So they're basically two different polar
Yeah,
opposites.
it's the art of being able to receive or not receive. The narcissist is just going to take it all, and this person is going to reject it all. So, yeah, like you say, either end of the spectrum is too far out. It's going to be detrimental in some way.
Yeah, and so as I said, I wasn't planning to talk about, but just go back to it. So interestingly, as narcissism as a concept has taken hold of externalizing blame, so has the pathogenicity model of what causes disease really taken hold, where the idea of, oh, you are personally responsible based on the state of your own body, the terrain of your own body, has very much fallen out of favor. And it's interesting actually that the terrain theory of disease was dismissed first quite a long time ago, whereas the kind of echo principles of taking responsibility and being modest and being humble and all the rest of it are more recent in terms of they're now out of fashion, but they are still out of fashion. Anyway, that was a little bit of an unnecessary tangent. But there are people, I guess this is the point, that very much believe that taking responsibility for your own health and optimizing your own terrain is, very important. And there are small elements of people who are mainstream-ish who talk about some elements of that, making sure you get enough sleep has become quite popular these days in the mainstream, largely thanks to the work of Matthew Walker, who kind of was in those influential circles, I think, talking to, top business people and entrepreneurs and stuff like that. So there's elements of that. So that's the kind of moderate terrain theory. Yeah, you should look after your sleep and lifestyle and meditation and this and that. But there are extreme advocates of the terrain theory. And so Aajonus, to go back to that, would be an example of one of those. So the Aajonus system, and again, if I got any of this wrong, and you're a fan of this work, then forgive me. I am paraphrasing and simplifying, and feel free to put any corrections in the comments on YouTube. But my understanding, so why did I dedicate time to learning about this in the first place? Well, one of the things that I liked about it is they talked about the lymphatic system a lot, which I am I've been learning about for a while now and doing stuff for. They talk about how toxicity is the fundamental cause of disease and ill health, which is fairly typical of a terrain-based system model of disease. It's fairly typical because that's usually the thing that disrupts the terrain. But there are other things, as we'll talk about before the end of this episode. For some reason, most of these terrain theory people focus primarily on toxicity, and this one is no exception. So
I mean, that kind of makes sense because I was going to ask, why do you think that is? But yeah, if we're toxic, then there's a lot going on. Yeah, it's not ideal.
yeah, and so the idea is that the immune system. Well, one of the things about it, I guess, is that the immune system both deals with external pathogens coming in, but it's also a waste processing system. Like the lymphatic system, for instance, is a key element of the whole immune system, actually often overlooked, but it's also the body's kind of
Sewage system. Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if the body's overloaded with sewage, then let's say the lymphatic system's overloaded with sewage, then the other things it's supposed to do, the lymphocytes and the T cells and all the rest of it, they kind of become secondary, and so the immune system isn't working so well. So that would be the easy kind of scientific explanation for it. So as I say, with this guy, the Primal Diet focuses very much on detoxification. They believe that most of the toxicity should at least leave through the skin. So that's a little bit interesting to me.
Do they give a reason why they say through the skin rather than, through through your bowel or your urethra?
Maybe I don't know it fully, but my understanding is that, it's the biggest detoxification organ.
Right.
I know it's the preferential way for things to go out to me, because it's doesn't require the liver processing. Toxins can go literally straight from blood to lymph out of the skin without having to put a burden on the liver and the kidneys. So I'm a fan of getting as much toxicity out through the skin. I don't know why they think that the vast majority goes out for the skin, though. No, it's a good question. Um, and uh, and so because of that, they're a big fan of hot baths, which is another thing that I'm a fan of. I've talked about many times before. So this was like a system where hot baths are essential feature,
Sign
and
me
then
up.
and another thing that's central is this is the first time I've ever seen a system where cheese. Eating large amounts of cheese is an essential element of the program that like helps with detoxification. I was like, oh, that's new.
How can cheese help with detoxification?
I'm about to get into
Okay.
it. It's a good question, and I was curious about exactly the same thing. Let me get back to the skin for a second. So they would say that if you have an infection on the skin, right, like fungal infection, bacterial infection, what they're actually doing is they're eating the toxins that are coming out via the skin. So they are helping you, not hindering you. That is the key thing to understand about this terrain theory, as opposed to the mainstream theory that you're probably used to thinking about.
So wait, just so I'm clear. So what's coming out of your skin is what the bacteria or the fungi or those organisms have eaten, and it's coming out that way. Is that what you're saying?
No,
No.
I'm
Okay. Yeah.
saying that they eat the toxins, those organisms. They're there
Oh,
because they
okay.
eat the toxins.
Right.
So the
Sorry.
best, I think like Tony Robbins is actually one of the people who, at least in the past, in his Living Health program, which I listened to many times, many years ago, he did a good analogy for the terrain. He was a strong terrain theory advocate, maybe the most famous of all terrain theory advocates. And he talked about a good analogy for this. He said, when the garbage collectors went on strike in New York, trash started to, just pile up on the streets, and eventually there were a bunch of rats there, right? They were attracted to the trash that had not been taken away. And he said that the mainstream perspective of that is to look at it and go, huh, why did the rats bring all this trash here? When in fact, it's the trash building up that brought in the
Cause the
rats.
rats. Yeah.
Now, what you just said there, Chrissy, and it was great that you did it because it shows the mainstream programming that we all have. You assumed that the bacteria were causing the trash, right? With what you just said.
Oh yeah, I guess it was just because of how it was phrased. I didn't quite understand, so putting it together. But no, yeah, what you're saying makes absolute sense. It's the terrain that has drawn the organisms to the point.
But again, I'm not making fun of you. You
Oh
are
no,
right.
no, I know you're
You
not. No.
you are right also that, and this is where I think Tony Robbins' thing slightly is not 100% accurate as well. Like, rats do then cause more trash. That is true, right? And ditto bacteria, fungi,
Oh
etc.
God, yeah, absolutely. We've got to clean up after them because they're there. Now we've got a whole nother thing that we have to take care of on top of the trash and on top of the rats.
Yeah, and the bacteria and fungi, they do create additional toxins that the body has to deal with. So it's a bit chicken and the egg as to, arguing what comes first. But the terrain theory people would say, as with the trash analogy, the trash comes first, the toxicity comes first. And so what I was saying about the skin is, as a lot of toxicity does or should go out of the skin, if you get an infection on your skin, for instance, what's going on from their perspective is that that infection is helping you. It is eating the toxicity that is coming out of the skin, is processing for you. So as I said, kind of where the pathogen and terrain people agree is that the lymphatic system does, both immune system and the sewage system of the body. But where they disagree is kind of what comes first and what is more primary. And the extreme on this, I'm going to talk about the extreme on the other side next. But the extreme on this side is the idea that, no, these organisms aren't even bad. They're trying to help you. Yes, even the so-called bad ones, the ones that you would normally take an antibacterial or an
Yeah,
antifungal
like
for.
let's say an H. pylori or something like that, that can, cause a lot of, I just said cause. But the how can I say, the consequence of having the overgrowth of the H. pylori can be quite a lot of discomfort and pain that a person will experience.
Yeah, yeah, and all of the infections. If you're talking about skin for a second, and whether it's ringworm or whether it's whatever, like some kind of skin infection, those things are trying to help you. That's the perspective of this system, that they help to neutralize toxins.
Genetic Insights provides cutting-edge, affordable DNA testing, giving you access to over 500 health reports that can help you in 3 key ways. They may be able to resolve your existing health challenges even when nothing else has worked. Using simple lifestyle changes, their reports can help you reduce your risk of developing future health challenges that you may be genetically predisposed to. And they can help you feel more confident in your health by showing you where you are genetically strong. Unlike most other genetic health testing companies, Genetic Insights tests over 83 million different variations in your genes, guaranteeing 99.7% accuracy across all of their DNA reports. They cover almost every aspect of health, including digestive issues, cardiovascular health, weight loss, hormonal and blood sugar balance, as well as nutrient needs, allergies and intolerances, and so much more. Using their system is quick and easy, and reading the reports is simple. If you've done an Ancestry DNA test, you can simply download your raw DNA data, upload it to the Genetic Insights platform, and within a few hours you will have access to genetic reports which give you a risk score for each specific issue and scientifically validated recommendations based on your individual genetic profile. Everything in your reports are based on scientific studies, and there are citation links throughout every report. If you are serious about optimizing your health and wellness and feeling great, then getting access to your Genetic Insights reports may be the most important health investment you will ever make. In the reports, not only will you gain insights into how to overcome existing health challenges and avoid future issues, you'll also discover which types of dietary, lifestyle, and even supplement protocols are best for your unique genetics. To get your unique genetic health reports, go to geneticinsights.co and use code Rejuvenate to get 20% off today. That's geneticinsights.co using coupon code Rejuvenate to get 20% off today. Yeah, because then it's going back into, well, why are they there in the first place? What is going on?
Yes. Another thing that they believe is that the body stores a lot of toxins in fat, which is my belief as well. And in this school of thought, actually being very thin is not good for health, because it means that your body does not have much storage capacity. So they actually believe that a moderate amount of body fat was like a healthy thing, not an unhealthy thing. As someone who's been thin my whole life and overweight none of my life, I still believe this is true. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying this to justify my own overweightness. I honestly observe that people who have a bit of extra fat on them often do have better health outcomes. Now, obviously, there's a point of diminishing returns for that, where too much fat is not good. Too much fat, first of all, because it shows that your body's storing more and more toxins, but second of all, because the fat then creates problems. Like fat cells are more likely to produce more estrogen, which creates problems in its own right, etc. But I think a moderate amount of fat, I do actually agree with that point. So let me read out a couple of the other things that are quite striking about this. So here's another quote. Before sending out toxicity through detox pathways, the body first has to neutralize it. Microbes eat diseased tissue and shrink waste significantly. Bacteria and molds reduce it by 20%. Parasites do it 100 times, 5 times more than bacteria. That's what they do. Aajonus called them our janitors. They do not eat healthy tissue. Crucial distinction. I'm not saying it's true, but of this system. They do not eat healthy tissue. Microbes are symbiotic, and some are even endogenous. So now, again, I don't know if that is accurate. I kind of doubt it. But as a concept, like, they're saying actually that parasites are highly desirable, and because they are very efficient at clearing up waste compared to other organisms, right? And if that sounds completely crazy, fair enough. But there are actually cases. I remember I even had one of the practitioners I work with. They didn't do it to me, but they did it to some of my clients. They gave them like a helminth worm, and all their symptoms went away. Their autoimmunity just disappeared. Like this is well known and well documented that sometimes bacteria make people. Sorry, sometimes parasites make people actually better, especially with autoimmune stuff, for whatever reason. Could be for this reason that they're saying, because it's so good at dealing with toxicity. Could be for another reason. Another key distinction, because this lends us right to what I want to talk about. So according to Aajonus, viruses are just enzyme structures or proteins. Enzymes are catabolic and break things down. Viruses are manufactured by the body as solvents and sent to cleanse diseased tissue in certain locations. The trade-off is that viruses are not as efficient as bacteria. Viruses only dissolve toxicity and do not reduce it. It stays 1-to-1, while bacteria reduce it 20-to-1. This creates many more symptoms because there's more toxicity floating around the body to be disposed of. So what does that mean? What that means is they're saying the reason why you have a viral infection is because you do not have enough of the more efficient organisms that process toxicity for you, like parasites and like bacteria and like yeast and fungi as well. And so then your body creates these viruses in order to process that toxicity, but the viruses are not very efficient at processing the toxicity, and that's why viruses tend to be associated with acute illnesses, like a cold or whatever. But could be things that are a lot more serious. So a bunch of from most people's perspective, extreme claims there. The idea that viruses, I think we talked about this in a previous episode, the idea that viruses are not necessarily organisms, and they don't meet all the criteria for life, even from a biochem point of view, they're a bit of an anomaly. But there is this school of thought among terrain theory people that viruses are actually just proteins created by the body. And as it says here, this theory is that they are solvents, so they're there to break down some of the toxicity. So it's a theory, right? Now I'm going to talk about in the context of the world, the real world, and the governments and the policies and the everything. I'm going to connect that to this in a second. I'll just finish this particular thread to say what the last thing that they claim is when the toxicity builds up too much and you don't have enough organisms to deal with it, then that's when you get the C word. That's when the cells start to multiply in a way that is not desirable and become malignant and, possibly kill you. Now, the other element of the primal diet by Aajonus is the what do you do about it section. And so every terrain person has a different take on that to some degree, although I do notice they do often have a bunch of stuff in common. The natural hygiene, for instance, that's another school of thought for terrain theory that's quite old, a lot older than Aajonus, and they definitely share some similarities with it. So one of the things, they tend to not like anything refined and processed, even down to like they don't like oils, for instance, because they consider that to be refined and processed. And they often don't like salt either for some reason. And again, Aajonus is no exception. But what makes the Aajonus system different is this focus on raw foods, and especially actually raw animal foods. So often when you see people talk about eating lots of raw animal food, I follow a bunch of people on social media who are like, eating a massive thing of raw steak or whatever. That's often people who've been influenced by, not always, but often people who've been influenced by this school of thought. So the idea is that, throughout most of our evolution and pretty much every other animal in the world, they eat their food raw, and that cooking, although it may make some stuff easier to digest, it destroys a lot of the beneficial elements in the food. And so to go back to the original thing that you said about cheese, so I'll just read another bit out here.
Yeah, how can cheese help you detoxify?
Yes. Raw foods are necessary to detoxify. They contain all their enzymes, vitamins, which are destroyed by cooking. They're fully bioavailable. Their chemical bonds haven't been severed by cooking, so the body can use them to bind to toxins. The body uses 50 to 200 molecules of fat or minerals, especially calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and potassium, to bind to toxins. However, when those minerals are cooked, they are cauterized, they become unable to exchange ions, and they are dead weight to the body. The body uses nutrients from raw foods, which have their chemistry intact, to remove toxic substances from the body, which have a wrong chemistry, either because they are not natural or because they do not belong in the human bodies. Some nutrients are good chelating agents that can bind to toxins, such as fats and minerals. Fats of both animal and plant origin, like butter and coconuts. Minerals found in things like raw milk, raw clay, oysters, green juice. I think Aajonus was originally like a raw vegan kind of person, but then switched to much more animal foods over time. Other nutrients are good solvents. So he's a fan of, yeah. Okay, so to just answer the cheese thing before I move on. Calcium in raw milk helps pull out cauterized calcium from pasteurized milk that's stored with the tissues. Okay, I didn't actually prepare the cheese one. Okay, basically what he says is that the minerals and the fats, especially within dairy, if they are not damaged by heat, are very effective at detoxifying. Now, something that's interesting actually about Aajonus, as opposed to a lot of other people who have opinions on detoxification, is that he claimed that all of his assertions about what isn't good at detoxifying were based on testing. So what he would do, and he claimed to have spent something like $1 million in testing altogether. So what he would do, he would get, say, anything, a piece of celery, a lump of cheese, and he would measure the amount of toxins that were in it, and then he would eat the thing or get someone to eat the thing, and then he would measure how much toxicity was excreted through the urine and the stool, I think, primarily. And so, for instance, he was a fan of some stuff like, shellfish, I just mentioned, oysters. And, some people are wary of that because it's got toxins in it, it tends to have mercury and stuff. But he said that when he did the testing, a lot more toxins go out of the body as a result of eating it than go into the body. So that's how he claimed he made those decisions about what is and is not good at detoxification, is by doing this meticulous measurement of what does the person excrete as a result of eating that food. So he claims that it was, quite empirical. I keep saying he claims. I've never actually seen all these test results, but this is the mythology around it. It may well be true. He was an interesting figure. He wasn't, just a bullshitter. He, one of the very practical things that he did, for instance, is he was a huge advocate for raw dairy and raw milk, and he created like a movement for that in the US, and helped with a lot of legal processes to help raw dairy farmers and stuff, people, to actually make that available to a lot of people. So if you live somewhere where raw milk is available, especially in the US, it may well be that Aajonus was part of making that possible for you. So he deserves, debt of gratitude for that, if nothing else. He did die reasonably young, but I think like in his 60s, but I think it was from falling off a balcony. And there's a lot of talk about, conspiracy about he didn't fall, he was pushed. And it is true, there seems to be a massive push by the people who we probably are not on our side to really demonize raw milk and raw dairy. And I think for reasons that are related to that topic that I started with. So remind me to come back to raw dairy if I forget. So that is the kind of system. There's a lot more to it, obviously, like everything. But that's kind of it in a nutshell. The toxicity is the issue. All these pathogens are actually our friends because they're helping us process toxins. The reason why viruses make us ill is just because they're not very efficient at processing toxins, and they're not really pathogens anyway. They're just proteins that our body creates itself. And that the best way to detox is to eat raw foods, especially of the ones that Aajonus identified. He was a fan of raw meat as well, raw dairy. I think, celery juice. There's quite a few raw fruits. Now, Where it gets really crazy with Jonas, just do this one more and then I'll go back to the more general point, is he's such a believer in that, and so are a lot of his followers, that not only are they not scared of those organisms, but they would actually actively take steps to introduce them into their body. So I'll give you two examples. One of the medicines that Jonas recommended was to eat moldy berries. Yeah, to actually, seek out the ones that are moldy and eat them.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's the beginning steps of, well, would you call it beginning steps of fermentation in a way? It's the bacteria that's starting to break it down. It's going that way.
It's far along the process of
Yeah.
fermentation once it's moldy. Um, yeah, so I would not do this, but I'm just saying that from their perspective, it is just adding in more detox support. Now, what about if you eat a bunch of moldy berries and get ill? Well, they would have an answer for that. They would say that that is because it is detoxifying you too quickly. And so they have a whole system. Like, first of all, you eat a bit of raw food and you eat more raw food. And so no one in that system is telling you to just start eating moldy berries, just to clarify. But I'm just telling you that some of the people who are really into it, who eat 100% raw, who follow all of his recommendations, they will eat moldy berries on purpose. Now, that might sound a little bit crazy, but then, a lot of us accidentally eat a moldy berry every now and then because most of the berries from the supermarket tend to be moldy. Now, what about high meat? Have you heard of this?
High meat, no.
So this is basically rotten meat.
Oh,
So,
God, I remember when when my husband went to Iceland, they have a delicacy over there, rotten shark.
yeah, okay, there you go.
Yeah,
That's rotten
yeah.
fish. Yeah.
But and no offense to anyone that really likes that as a delicacy, but when he came home and some gloves that he had purchased still kind of had that lingering aroma, they were no longer allowed to stay in the house. They had to be removed. So yeah, I don't know that I could go that way.
Yeah. And so we're talking about like meat that's been rotting for months, I think even potentially years. Sometimes they do, like they keep it in jars and they're eating this. And, when you look at it, it's not just fermented, it's like rotten, right? It's actually rotten and moldy in many cases. And they're eating this. Now, to be fair to these people, what actually is amazing is that some of them, they'll do that and not get sick, which kind of in itself should bring up a couple of questions about the whole infectious model as cause of disease. Like, why are these people not getting sick when they're eating these things that a lot of people, most people would get sick from? And probably goes without saying, but they would be totally happy to eat meats that normally people wouldn't eat raw, like for instance, raw chicken.
I was going to ask, when you were starting to mention that, I was like, oh, then maybe there are some animals that are excluded from this, especially chicken or poultry or things like that can make you ill straight away. But
I'm pretty sure chicken is definitely not on that list. They might not eat pork, but I don't think it's anything to do with any pathogens. It might just be for some other reason. I can't actually remember that. As I said, I didn't properly research this because it's more part of a bigger point.
Yeah.
But so all right. So that's one. To most people, that's pretty extreme. Even those of us who are probably in the alternative, or so-called alternative health world to some degree, if you're listening to a podcast like this, if we're talking about like eating meat that has been rotting for months, years, that's going to seem pretty extreme, I think, to the vast majority of people listening to this, because it's taking on faith, this idea that these organisms are all helpful to. That's kind of walking the talk, right? Like you can say, "Oh, yeah, I'm a terrain theory person. I don't believe that. I don't believe viruses exist, and I think that all these organisms are just trying to help us." So saying it is one thing, and maybe refusing to take antibiotics and stuff like that. I certainly know a bunch of people like that, but like actually actively trying to add as many of these so-called pathogens into the body as possible by eating them. That's a whole level of commitment to this that I actually personally have not met in person someone who was in the process of doing that. I've met a lot of kooky people. I've met a lot of people, for instance, who thought that they were, who drank their own urine and, washed in their own urine in inverted commas and thought that was a great health practice, all of that kind of stuff. But I actually not met anyone who loves to eat rotten raw meat. But I would like to. I'd love to talk to them. So that's one end of the spectrum that it seems kind of crazy to, maybe most people. But I wanted to draw this kind of point of contrast to talk about like the other side of the coin when it comes to that. So, just as a kind of introduction to this, I wanted to play a clip, and I think we're going to add this in post production for the sake of convenience for Chrissy and I. So, there's something going on right now, and as I said, we won't go into the politics of it. That's for the news show. But there is something going on right now in the health world, which is that the US is the most powerful country in the world that really sets the policy for most of the world. And the health and human services is, in a way, the most powerful branch of that government, other than, the actual president or whatever, because health is a huge, huge industry. It takes up a substantial portion of the GDP. And in terms of the pharmaceutical companies, they are, huge. People talk all the time about the military-industrial complex, but I think those who know talk about how the pharmaceutical interests are actually way more powerful, have way more influence. And part of it is because they're some of the only profitable companies actually in the NASDAQ or whatever. Like the vast majority of companies hardly make any actual profit. They've got these super high valuations. Often they have super high revenue. But there are a few companies that actually make profit, like Apple would be one of them. But a lot of them are barely making any profit, and they have these super high valuations. Pharmaceutical companies are not in that category. Pharmaceutical companies make profit. They make a lot of actual money. And there are a lot of vested interest to keep it that way. And so someone is in charge now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., often called Bobby by his followers, who claims, and again, I won't assert whether, he's believable or trustworthy or whatever, but claims to, first of all, want to address the chronic health epidemic in the US specifically, especially for children. And he made a kind of announcement about that. And I just want to play you a 30-second clip about what he has in mind in that regard. And this speech that he's about to give was not to a friendly audience. This was to the team at Health and Human Services. In case you haven't heard of that, Health and Human Services is the organization that oversees all the other health agencies you may have heard of, like the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, like the CDC, Center for Disease Control. You may have heard of that in relation to like pandemics and stuff, like the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. This is, has a big say in terms of scientific research around health and medicine and all the rest of it. So all those other agencies you may have heard of are controlled by this one. This guy's just been put in charge of it. And this is his speech to those people, trying to get him on their side. Trying to get them on his side, while simultaneously also kind of saying what he actually wants to do. And again, his big claim focus is on the chronic health epidemic. And why this matters is because this has been completely ignored by everyone in the mainstream. There are no politicians in my country, the UK, who are talking about this. Otherwise, I'd be talking about it. I know that Americans get sick of people outside of America commenting on their country or whatever, and I do understand that. But the problem is your country affects every other country so strongly. And second of all, if someone like this were doing something like this in the UK, I would definitely be talking about it too. But there is no one in the UK doing this. There is no one that I know of in the EU doing this. There's no one in China doing this. There's no one in Brazil doing this. There's no one in Russia doing this. There's no one hardly anywhere that I know who actually is even talking about it. Whether you trust them or not, whether you believe that they're actually capable of making any changes or not, no one else is even pretending that they're going to address this chronic health epidemic. Everyone else is ignoring it. In the world of government, which are the people who create the policies and the laws and do a lot of the funding, everyone else just acts like it isn't happening, and the only argument is about who's paying for more mainstream medicine. That's what it always is. In this country, that's what it is. More money for the NHS or less money for the NHS, but it's never about, is the NHS actually working? Then NHS stands for National Health Service. This is like our free healthcare that we have in the UK. No one talks about, like, if the NHS is so great, why are we getting more and more unhealthy? Why are people getting more and more obese? Why are people having more and more chronic health conditions? Why is there more cases of allergies? Why is there more cases of autoimmune diseases? Why is there more cases of diabetes and all these other things? Like, no one is talking about that. So in the US, at least someone is talking about it. And now that someone has actually been technically put in charge of those agencies, and he is claiming that he's going to get to the bottom of it. And he has his own opinions about what caused it. But in this speech, he's talking about how he's going to put all his opinions aside. Don't worry if you have a different opinion. And he's just going to fund science and research to find out what is actually causing the chronic health epidemic. So just the very quick bit I wanted to play you was the bit about the kind of things that he's going to be investigating.
Some of the possible factors we will investigate were formerly taboo or insufficiently scrutinized. The childhood vaccine scheduling, electromagnetic radiation, glyphosate, other pesticides, ultra-processed foods, artificial food additives, SSRI and other psychiatric drugs, PFAs, PFOAs, microplastics. Nothing is going to be off limits.
Okay, so that's all I wanted to play. So do you notice anything interesting about that list that he's just said there, Chrissy?
To be fair, it sounds like a lot of stuff that we make and that we're putting into our food, like glyphosate, things like that. It's all the toxins and stuff that it seems like a lot better not to have.
Yeah, bingo, toxins. So what I think is revolutionary about this, and why there's such a level of shrieking hysteria against him from all kinds of mainstream corners, is because everything he just said is terrain theory, right? Everything that he just said is toxicity. There was no talk about any infectious anything. Did you notice that? Like, it was, yeah, it's glyphosate, it's
seed oils,
it's food additives, it's ultra processed foods, it's childhood vaccinations. That's the thing that you're the least allowed to talk about as a potential culprit. It's EMFs, right? It wasn't only substances. He's even talking about frequencies, all the kind of stuff that people that you and I hang out with say all the time. But no one who's ever said this in any significant role in government, like actually in government, as opposed to sometimes they say it once they're retired or whatever, but let alone the head of the person who's in charge of all the health agencies, right? So no wonder there's so much resistance, because and so this is the point that I wanted to draw. Like, it is extreme to be eating rotten meat and moldy berries because you believe that bacteria are good for you, or mold is good for you, in my opinion. But there is something else that I think is extreme, but I think it's kind of just accepted. So and to not give judgment, just like I tried not to give judgment to the Aajonus section as much as possible, let me not give judgment to this as well. So let's say that you're a follower of the Pasteur system of understanding what causes disease, right? So if the main and really only worth mentioning and focusing on threat to disease is pathogens, then, and you're thinking of measles, you're thinking of polio, you're thinking of flu, you're thinking of smallpox, you're thinking of all of these things, then what's going to be your focus, right? Well, one of the things that you might be focused on is studying those organisms, right? Okay, fair enough. Another thing you might end up being focused on is, like, you start to observe that these different pathogens mutate. And so you might start studying their mutations. Then you might start getting really clever and you might go, I wonder if we can mutate them ourselves to see what happens. Okay. And then also, but of course that in and of itself is, not really helping people. So your main focus is probably going to be, okay, how can we get the immune system to fight off these infectious agents? Because remember, that is the fundamental precept of what they believe, right? So, okay, so here's a follow-up question. How can we even tell if a person is able to fight off an infectious disease? And the answer that they discover then is these things called antibodies. So your body has the first line defense immune system, which is this more generalized systemic inflammatory action, and then it has so that's called the innate immune response, and it has the adaptive immune response. This is where your body has actually worked out what the organism is that is attacking, the pathogen is that's attacking, and it's worked out a specific type of immune component, an antibody, to actually deal with that specific pathogen. And so you'd be like, okay, so we're really worried about these specific infectious agents because at one point they were killing a lot of people. And we are trying to, the result we're trying to achieve is we're trying to achieve as many of the population as possible having antibodies to that disease. So some bright spark decided, well, one of the things that we could do, why don't we expose people to just a little bit of that infectious agent so that then the immune system can create those antibodies. And when they first were doing that, they were doing that with live infectious agents. I think they were literally just injecting people with infectious diseases. And I mean, there's a bit of dispute about the history of this, but let's just say that didn't always work. Because, of course, if you inject or in other way add a live pathogen to someone, sometimes it'll just proliferate and become a full-on infection, right? So that's problematic. So, okay, well, what else can we do? Well, let's try injecting the dead, like an inactivated dead version of the pathogen. Then hopefully the body will create the antibodies, but the infection won't spread because it's dead. Genius. Makes perfect sense, right? Again, with this system of thought. So then they do that. One problem. The body's immune system is pretty smart, and if you inject it with dead organisms, there's some degree of immune response, especially that, and that initial immune response, some kind of inflammatory response. But the body is wise to the fact that it is not live, and so it doesn't create antibodies. Damn, back to the drawing board. Now, the next decision they made is the kind of decision that could only really be made, in my mind, if you really, 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 really believe that pathogens are a problem and toxins are not. In the same way that I said about the primal diet guys, you have to really, really, really believe that toxins are a problem and pathogens are not to start eating rotten meat and moldy berries, right? Well, similarly, you have to really, really, really believe that pathogens are a problem and toxins are not to come up with the deductive leap that they came up with next. They're like, okay, so the body is not responding if we just inject a little bit of this dead pathogen. What about if we put a toxin with it? Because then the immune system will respond to the toxin. And they then did that, and that worked. The body did, because the immune system went into a full-on panic, because remember, the terrain theory people are at least a little bit right, that the immune system is not only for fighting off pathogens, it is also the body's sewage processing system. So if you pump in a bunch of sewage, if you add a bunch of sewage, the immune system is really going to go into it. And sure enough, it tricked the body successfully, and the body did actually create antibodies. And so they were like, Eureka, this is awesome. Now, that may be okay. But then they're like, well, what other pathogens have we got that might be a problem? And now we're at a place where, the average child before they're 18 is, injected, if they're following the government guidelines, over 70 times with these dead pathogens, not really a problem, but then all the what they call adjuvants that go with it. And it turns out you need quite a lot of poison to trick the body into creating those antibodies. And look, for those of you who are really on top of this whole subject, I know you might be like, oh, the body doesn't even create antibodies before a certain age, and it's completely pointless doing this with, babies and all the rest of it. That may be true. I don't know enough about it. I've certainly come across that perspective. But I'm trying to give the best possible reading of that school of thought, just like I tried to give the best possible reading to the opposite primal diet school of thought, right? Like this is valid within its own precepts, but what happens when you completely focus on creating antibodies to pathogens as like your whole focus, and also doing studies on pathogens trying to create more, virulent, more infectious, more dangerous type of pathogens. COVID, it turns out, was probably created, I think we're allowed to say this now, it's becoming mainstream, by a company, was funded at least, by a company called Eco Health Alliance. What a name, right? It's like, it's all good things. Eco, great. Health, awesome. Alliance, all working together, brilliant. And then, wait, you were doing what? It's like when I want to do research about a specific nutrient, about what effects it has, often it's difficult because there's so little money spent on it. There's so little research, and definitely on toxins as well, which is what RFK was talking about in that clip. But they spend a fortune on research of, let's take really deadly pathogens and make them more deadly. Let's take really infectious pathogens and make them more infectious. So there's loads of budget for that. So to me, that attitude is as crazy as eating moldy berries and rotten meat. They're both just extreme ends of the spectrum. Like, one of them takes it on faith that pathogens are always good for you pretty much no matter what, and I'm going to add as many to my body as possible. The other one takes it on faith that having antibodies to pathogens is the most important thing, and toxins are no big deal, and we can add as many toxins as we want, and it's fine. And if there's any side effects, it can't be because of that. It's not a side effect. It's a coincidence. And now I say this because I know some people believe that there are some very malicious people who are behind all this, but there's a very large amount of people who are healthcare professionals who are not malicious. They're not trying to hurt anyone. This is what they actually think. This is what they actually believe. And so we have to actually understand that. And so what just to discuss the thing, I've talked a lot about this because I think it's the most extreme, but I definitely don't think that being vaccinated or not being vaccinated is the be all and end all. I barely had any as a child. I think I had like 1 or 2, and I still had all kinds of chronic health problems. So I just think my opinion is it's yet another toxic insult. That's all. And is it worth it because of its ability to create those antibodies to very dangerous pathogens? Maybe. I'm not even going to comment on that. But I'm just saying it's just another toxic insult. And so I think that a lot of what RFK is talking about in that particular clip of looking at all the toxic insults, he only mentions the jabs as one of them, but he talks about, as I said, what's in the food, even, the EMFs and all the rest that's in our airwaves everywhere, the food additives, the this, the that, all the different potential toxic insults, I think is revolutionary, not because it's not obvious to people like you and I probably watching, but because it's so far away from the model of where conventional science and medicine is, which is that all of these toxins are no big deal.
Yeah, it's that thing of like what they say, that one more drop in a cup that takes you over the top. It's like at some point the dam will break. It just will.
Absolutely. Okay, so now we're at that point. Oh, I was going to say something about raw dairy, wasn't
Yes. You said please come back to, where was it?
Oh, yes.
Come back
Okay.
to raw dairy.
So raw dairy is an interesting example because when dairy is raw, it is true, documented. I'll try and find just a sheet that shows the difference, Chrissy, we can put up on screen for people if I can find it. But basically, there's loads and loads and loads of stuff like lactoferrin, like immunoglobulins, like all kinds of stuff, which is, you don't have to believe in the primal diet, but which just is by science a lot higher or like present in raw dairy that is not in pasteurized dairy. And so, and on the other hand, the chances of suffering from an infection from raw dairy that is, significant, that actually has an impact, is pretty small. I think it's something like 1 in 50,000, something like that. And so the fact, now I'm not saying Did I just say raw dairy is safe? I did not. What I said is that the safety margin is pretty good. But, if we compare that to all the foods that are not only allowed, but even encouraged to be eaten, there's kind of a meme these days about Fruit Loops, right? Like Fruit Loops are in the food pyramid and they're considered to be, like they're encouraged to be eaten by the government, basically. They're like classified as healthy, unlike steak or eggs, which are classified as unhealthy.
Yeah. I mean, like, don't get me wrong. I loved Fruit Loops when I was a kid, but I can't see that as a staple today. It's like, no, I wouldn't even let my kids have that. But yeah.
And, they talked about this as well, and now on mainstream news, how in the US, the Fruit Loops have so many worse ingredients than like in Canada and the EU or UK, because they just don't have the restrictions on food additives and stuff.
Yeah, because that was always my thing from going from here, from the States to here, things like that. I'm like, well, why can't I get that here? And now I understand, because they're a lot looser over there than they are here.
Yeah, exactly. So what I would say is it's not as if raw dairy is completely risk-free, but to think that it is risky enough that, and in the US, there are armed groups of government agents coming in with guns, confiscating all the raw dairy and leading all the people away as if they are, poisoning people. Well, again, Fruit Loops are like recommended as like an important food group on the food pyramid or whatever. Like, how is that possible? Do you understand? That's because people like us are just, that's crazy, and just dismiss it. But no. Let's not dismiss it. Let's understand it. It makes sense from the pathogens are king, toxins are irrelevant frame, which the whole mainstream medical system is fundamentally built upon. Like, it does make sense from that context. Notice one of the things that RFK said on that list as well is pharmaceutical drugs. In this case, he picked SSRIs, which I think is a good one because they are being discredited on a really wide basis right now. But, I know a lot of people in the alternative world feel like there's a lot of pharmaceutical drugs where the toxicity outweighs the benefits in many cases. And again, but that's not ever considered because the toxicity is always considered to be like irrelevant.
In an ideal world, you'd meet all of your nutritional needs in the form of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, and more from the foods you eat. However, unless you prepare all of your food at home from scratch using the highest quality ingredients possible, the reality is that most of us need some nutritional support. Most of us need to take supplements if we want to look, feel, and perform at our best on a consistent daily basis. And this is especially true if you have genes that give you an elevated need of certain nutrients. And this is where Feel Younger can help. What I love about Feel Younger is that they offer a huge range of quality supplements and healthcare products formulated and endorsed by Owen Robinson, including must-haves like magnesium glycinate and vitamins B12, D3, and K2. And they do it at affordable prices with free shipping for orders over $50 without ever compromising on quality, purity, or potency. To learn more about how Feel Younger supplements can give your health a boost while supporting this podcast, please visit feelyounger.net and use promo code Rejuvenate to get 20% off your first order. That's promo code Rejuvenate for 20% off your first order at feelyounger.net. Well, if you just listen to you guys, you're so lucky over here. You don't have pharmaceutical commercials. And sorry, I know we're just detracting, but at the end, it's like they speed up all of the side effects, and death is usually how some of them end. And it's because they have to say that. And it's like, well, why would I take it? I don't know. But then it just makes sense because how you're talking about like the difference between toxins versus pathogens. So like that there's an understanding now a little bit more.
Yeah, and RFK said he wanted to ban those, so we'll see if that actually happens. That would be a good example of him actually, doing what he said he's going to do. I'd say that's positive progress. And I think about that, Chrissy, I think they've talked about that, and those pharmaceutical ads are actually not so much to try and sell them, because as you said, like it all sounds really negative. It's actually perhaps just to protect them from scrutiny.
That's all it is. Yeah. You were warned. How could you not have seen that commercial? Sorry.
Oh no. I'm saying that the pharmaceutical companies are only advertising to stop the news of that same company investigating them or ever saying anything negative about it.
Oh, okay.
That's what I'm saying. It's called defensive marketing in the marketing world. You advertise with someone not in order to promote your product, but to stop any negative coverage of your product from the people you're advertising with. I was just watching a comedy called Tires, which was quite funny, a sitcom, and the guy invites some person around to do a puff piece on him, and he sees all sorts of horrible things, and he's like, he's like, oh, please don't write a bad article about us just because of everything he's seen. And he goes, well, why shouldn't I? You guys have done this and that and that. And he goes, it's not like you're an advertiser with us. And he goes, wait a minute. And he goes, so, he does. So he ends up committing to $500 of advertising, and like they get rid of the piece criticizing them. And it was, it was a funny thing. I recommend that series, Tires. But that actually is how a lot of the advertising world works when it comes to huge corporations. It's like, it's not just pharmaceutical companies. It's like, we already heard of you. We already heard of McDonald's or whatever it might be. The reason why they're advertising is so that they don't get any criticism. That's, a lot of what that is about. And so that's one of the key reasons to ban that, is that then, there's less disincentive for the news or even other outlets. I mean, it's not just news, right? Like, when have you ever seen a sitcom that criticizes a pharmaceutical? It's the same thing, right? It's still the advertising is paying for the programming. So anyway, so in terms of dairy, if we compare like the potential benefits, the potential risks, the potential benefits are really high and the potential risks are really low, at least for most group of people. Obviously if someone's immunocompromised, maybe pregnant, it's a bit of a different story. But they don't care because their focus is all on reducing pathogenicity, right? And that's basically it. So I think that's the fundamental thing with the raw dairy. So all right, so I just want to end by making my bigger point now, to give my opinion on this for the first time. So I think that both of those perspectives are crazy, personally. Like, someone who I knew well had an infection recently, a viral infection, and I said, go to the doctor and get an antiviral. I'm not of this belief at all. But on the other hand, if someone said to me, is it a good idea to inject myself with a load of poisons so that it creates an immune response, which will create antibodies, I would think very carefully about that as well, right? I just feel like I'm moderate. I feel like I'm in the middle. And I'm not blaming anyone who's done either of those things. If you've injected yourself with poisons or eaten poisons, I mean, I used to smoke. This is the thing. Like, I do think that the vaccine thing is a bit overblown. I remember at the time, a friend of mine said every day he would have his best friend calling him and saying, "Oh, I'm so worried that I'm going to be forced to take this jab." And meanwhile, they were chain smoking and drinking wine the whole time. And I'm like, it's like, they're freaking out about one toxic insult, but the toxicity of all that stress is very high. The toxicity of all those cigarettes is high. And I know people say they think nicotine is beneficial. Okay, but what about the cadmium? What about the mercury? What about the tar? What about all the rest of it? Like, even the wine, the alcohol, but also the sulfites and all the other stuff in there. It's like, and the way toxic things work, I think generally it's better to have one toxic insult occasionally than to have like all day, every day, smaller toxic insults, because your body never gets a chance to recover. So, and I'm not trying to minimize if someone has had, say, a family member who had severe side effects and it's been disabling or whatever. I'm not minimizing that, but that is pretty uncommon for the reason I'm saying. That a lot of the time toxicity is more cumulative, and that's the problem with it. It's very hard to prove because of how cumulative it is. It's like, and it's exactly what you said about the water thing, Chrissy. It's like fine, and then suddenly overflowing. And, is it the fault of the thing that you had just before it started overflowing? Or is it the accumulation over that whole period of time that's at fault? I would say it's both, but it's especially the accumulation over that period of time. Here's the other thing I would say, and this is to critique RFK, because I've praised him a little bit. I think he is oversimplifying as much as the mainstream medical establishment is. So they're to, focus pretty much exclusively on pathogens in the way that I just said. Yes, I know they occasionally focus on nutrients and they occasionally focus on hormones and neurotransmitters, but as I say, the most of the apparatus is all about pushing this pathogen model, even with, in terms of the research, in terms of the risks they're willing to take with people's health. It's all about the pathogens. And RFK's focus seems to be all about the toxins. And I just want to remind people there is more to health than that. And so when I'm working with people, I am surprised at how often how impactful just addressing a nutritional deficiency is. For instance, we had one example, someone who was actually, most people want to stay private, which makes sense, but we had one person who, did an interview on this channel where they shared their results as a result of just adding one amino acid, glycine, how it completely transformed their lives. But I've seen way more cases of that than I thought, because it's so funny. Like, I used to give these more simplistic health advices, and then it often wouldn't work. And now I'm like telling people it's complicated and there's all these other factors. And I keep seeing these people like, oh, I just took this nutrient and I feel all better. So it's like funny how life works. But obviously it isn't always that simple, but I'm saying it's definitely a factor to consider. And I think if you're only focused on toxicity, now I'm not saying, I guess with Aajonus, he's focused on toxicity and nutrients, because it's all about having this raw food that he believes is the most nutritious. So nutrients is one. Biochemical imbalances is another one that I think is often ignored. We've talked about this a lot on this channel, especially in the area of hormones. The vast majority of people, especially as they get older, would feel better through optimizing their hormones. But it's not only as you get older. Most of us are born with at least one hormonal imbalance genetically. And knowing that and taking steps to address it, either with nutrition, lifestyle, whatever, or potentially even by maybe herbs, so let's say cortisol, reducing cortisol, things like that. But maybe sometimes even adding in a bioidentical version of that hormone can be life-changing for people. And it helps the other stuff. If the hormones are balanced, so for instance, if cortisol's too high, you're going to burn through nutrients a lot more quickly, like for instance potassium. But if thyroid is too low, then your body's going to be much slower at addressing and dealing with toxins, right? So these are important factors as well that I think, as I said, I'm happy that someone is talking about something other than pathogens and the cost of healthcare when it comes to health. But let's talk about all of it, right? Let's talk about this as well. And I know I'm pretty sure he is on bioidentical hormone replacement. So he probably is a believer. Maybe he's chosen this toxin thing because it's the most contentious, so he's picking the biggest battle first. I hope so. I did see in one of his posts where he challenged the FDA. He talked about peptides and stuff like that, and how he was going to do research into them and stop the FDA's war on those things. And if true, that sounds good. I think more freedom of choice is always a good thing for people. And he didn't mention bioidentical hormones, but I guess they're often in that category. And I would love it if a lot more people were accurately diagnosed with low thyroid function, for instance. I would love it if a lot more women were given bioidentical progesterone, especially as they get older. I'd love it if a lot more men were given bioidentical testosterone as they get older, for instance. That would make a huge difference to people's health and people's quality of life. In the case of progesterone, it's very strongly anti-mutated cells, very strongly anti-inflammatory. It could really save a lot of people's lives as well as improve their quality of life. Lifestyle factors, I'm aware that RFK, I think, is aware of them. If nothing else, he's got this friendship with Jack Cruz. I watched an interview that they did together, and so he's certainly aware of the circadian stuff, for instance. But I would love if that was more talked about. I noticed one of the changes they made is they unbanned incandescent light bulbs, which I think is a great thing, because incandescent light has a lot more infrared light. And we have to remember that up until, about 100 years ago, a human being had never come across a source of light that was not predominantly infrared. The sun is predominantly infrared, at least 50%, over 50% during sunrise and sunset. Candle, over 50% infrared. Fireplace, over 50% infrared. So it's lights that is devoid of infrared, which is what modern day LEDs are, is completely unnatural. It completely messes with all our hormones. It messes with our cortisol, but it also messes with our leptin. It messes with everything. It's terrible. So things like that, I think, are very important to address and talk about. Sleep, all of that kind of stuff. And interestingly, even some of the pathogens, I think, are, ignored to our peril. There's excessive focus on acute infections, but I actually think there's not enough focus on the chronic infections, the infections that lie in a kind of semi-dormant state, sometimes hidden by biofilms, sometimes active, depending on the relative vitality of the person at the time, that are just consistently undermining a person's health, but they're not focused on by these the mainstream, again, because they don't kill you, because they're not life threatening, but they are quality of life threatening. And so I would like to see a lot more research into things like SIBO, for instance. And then lastly, the emotional, psychological. There are obviously many people in the alternative who are focusing on that, who have focused on that for a long time. Probably one of the most well-known these days is like Gabor Mate, but there's lots of them. But like, how about let's actually talk about that in a mainstream element? When can we stop like traumatizing people? And you could say there is talk about this because there's like people with their trigger warnings and their safe space and all the rest of it. But this is an incorrect approach to trauma. Like, it's true that when you're highly traumatized, you kind of you need this kind of a safe space. You need a period where you are being less, where you can just recover, where you can like let your nervous system calm down. But unfortunately, that's not what is being facilitated. What seems to be being facilitated is a lot of people focusing on feeling victimized, and focusing on their anger about that and their fear about that and all the rest of it, and not a lot of focus on self-empowerment and taking personal responsibility and all the things that actually help a person to overcome a emotionally dysregulated, traumatized state of being. So I would love more focus on that as well. And I think with everything I just said, there's a genetic component to it. So there's a genetic component as to why you might need more of a nutrient than someone else. There's a genetic component as to why you might be more susceptible to being negatively impacted by toxin than someone else. There's a genetic component to why you might have a hormone imbalance. There's a genetic component to why different lifestyle factors might affect you differently. There's a genetic component to even like how you're impacted by emotional trauma and how you're impacted by other emotional and psychological factors. And so knowing those about yourself helps as well. And I think that's what's necessary for a real resolution of the chronic health epidemic. So I'm very happy that this completely ignored element of the chronic health epidemic is starting to become mainstream and starting to be talked about by people in charge of government health agencies. But I feel like if our focus is pretty much exclusively on toxicity, we're just going to be going from one extreme to possibly even another one. And what we actually need to do is look at all the pieces together. And if we do that, and I think that's really necessary. So I know that this right now does not have a big enough audience it's going to reach RFK. But then again, I know a bunch of people who know him. I know one person who spent a lot of time with him. So who knows? Maybe they'll pass it on to him. Maybe he'll hear it. Please focus on, and maybe it probably won't be him. But what I'm excited about when I see people like that is, I don't know if he's going to do anything. I don't know if he's going to do something good. But what I do know is this. The hardest to do is to be first at something. Remember, like the 4-minute mile? Like, no one had ever done it before, and then one person did it, and then a load of other people did it.
Yeah.
So no one has ever become the head of the health of a country, or let's say a major country, talking about resolving the chronic health epidemic. This is the first time. Even if RFK completely lets us down, please do not. Maybe he's a shill, like some people who follow me say. Maybe he's whatever, controlled opposition. That's all possible. I don't know. But the fact that a person with that message has got into that position is hopeful and encouraging to me, not because of him, but because of the people who made that happen. And so the people, like the voters, and if the people who made that happen can make it happen with this person, they can keep making it happen until someone comes in who actually does do what they say, who does transform things, and hopefully many people, right? Because it's probably going to be incremental progress. Maybe he will make a little bit of progress with the toxicity issue. Maybe then we'll have to have someone else in there who's going to make a bit of progress with the nutrient issue. Just whatever, just off the top of my head. But so the more people who we get in there who actually understand everything that we're talking about, the better. And so I'm pretty much a single issue voter. Obviously I didn't vote in that election. I'm not American, but if anyone shows up in the UK who, that's their stated mission, I'm going to give them a chance, because no one else is even claiming that they're going to do this. Pretty much no matter what else they say. If they say they're going to go in there and they're going to resolve the chronic health epidemic, because nothing else matters if we're all dead and dying, right? This is the thing. There's already, they talk about overpopulation, but we're going to have a population crisis soon the other way, because fertility has got so low, the birth rate has got so low, even though people are not living any longer than they were 50 years ago or even 100 years ago, and they're actually sicker at a younger age than they were. So we're declining in that way. That's the direction that we're going in. So you can have all kinds of opinions about every other aspect of governance or politics, but if we're all too sick to even function, which we're not far away from anymore as a species, then the whole thing is just going to collapse. And that's why even the people who, I'll give a slight political take, even the people who think that everyone involved in this is 100%, a shill and a liar and has an ulterior motive and all the rest of it, maybe. But I actually think they might start to turn around the health epidemic, because I think even those people who kind of control us, who maybe think of us just as cattle, like they don't care about us at all, but I think, or they think of us as slaves or possessions, but do you really want a slave who's like too sick to work? That's like counterproductive. So I do actually think that they're going to turn around this health situation to some degree, because they have to, because otherwise the whole thing is going to collapse. Just RFK already talked about like over 75% of young people would fail to get like even qualify for service in the military because they're too unhealthy. Like, at what level does that get to the point where, you don't have a functioning country anymore? Is it 80%, 90%, 95%? Like, if no one is capable of functioning in the military, they're probably not going to be capable of functioning in many other, actually crucial roles, and the whole thing's going to collapse. So this is serious, right? This is beyond politics. This is humanity, and whether we actually survive or not let's say as a civilization. I mean, I guess there'll always be a few stragglers, but are we going to survive as a civilization? This chronic health epidemic is a, big deal.
Yeah, it is a very big deal too. It's because it's like what comes after us is only as good as we are. And if we're declining, which is exactly what you're saying, there isn't going to be anything left. So we've got to start turning it around now. And like you said, education is the very first part of it, because so many people, they're just like, well, no, I'm sick, and so I go to the doctor and I get my pill. It's like that education has to start. And like you say, it's the first time it's ever been spoken about so publicly in such a high space. Whether or not he's actually going to do any good, be able to do any good, anything like that, don't know. But what is absolutely evident is the health of humanity needs to change on all fronts.
Absolutely. Yeah, if we're going to survive as a species. And I know some people are like, well, humans are so destructive to the environment, Well, okay, like if you really, really want to help the environment, then probably ending your own life is like the best way of doing it. But
that's not what you're advocating.
It's definitely not what I'm advocating. So, I used to be in the environmental movement. There's this concept of low impact living, like having the least kind of impact. This is way before this concept of carbon footprint or whatever. This is like 25 years ago. And it was just, like obviously litter minimally and all the rest of it, and recycling. And it is good, right? We don't want to act like, an arrogant whatever, just polluting and destroying everything around us. But I think that some of the environmentalism goes too far, and it goes to, it'd be better if there were a lot less humans. Well, then we're getting to, that makes sense again from the idea of the universe being fundamentally material. Like, so where physicality is primary and that's all there is. But we've got to remember, consciousness is not something that is understood by mainstream science, not really. There does seem to be something different and unusual about human beings, even if maybe it's not unique. And it's what we are. Like this idea of not being on the side of your own species is interesting to me. And so, I am pro-human, right? I am obviously I'm wanting humans to be better, to be less destructive and more virtuous and more, self-responsible and all of that good stuff. But I don't think the solution is just to like implode in upon ourselves and make ourselves extinct or almost extinct. That's not the way forward. And but I think a lot of people in charge do think that's the way forward, and I think a lot of people actually who aren't in charge are very normal people because they, I used to work in all kinds of, I used to work in factories and I used to work in, restaurants and I used to work in, all kinds of, I don't know, people on minimum wage or near minimum wage, basically. And a lot of those shared those kind of sentiments with me that, human beings we're kind of like doomed. We're kind of, it'd be better if we weren't here. And I'd say, that's the kind of expression of what in psychology you might actually call depression. If you believe that we, if you believe that we as a species don't really deserve to exist or shouldn't exist, or it'd be better if we didn't exist or whatever, that's really like an externalization of feeling that way about yourself, which is depression. And what's depression? Depression is often caused by ill health. It's very unusual for someone who is optimal in all the ways that I just talked about, optimal nutrient status, optimal toxicity, optimal hormones, etc., 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 who then goes, be better if I didn't exist. That's a sign of sickness and imbalance to feel that way, because you don't see any other mammals, opining about how the universe would be better off if they weren't there or their other species members weren't there. That's a sickness. And so unfortunately, people with a sickness, in this case, like a mind sickness, a brain sickness, are creating policy and in steering the course of this world. And so that's why I'm willing to forgive a lot from any leader who I believe is fundamentally pro-human, who is trying to help humans thrive, who is trying to help them to be healthy, because I think the healthier we are, the better the decisions we make. I think if you're truly healthy, you're not as destructive. You're not going to be polluting the planet. You're not going to be torturing animals. You're not going to be doing all of these horrible things that make some of us despair of humanity. I think all of those awful things that make us despair of humanity are rooted in ill health. And so that's another reason why, to me, health is the fundamental things, even though I could easily talk about philosophy or politics or psychology or all kinds of other subjects. I chose health because I feel like it is the root of all the others.
Yeah, you make a very valid point there too. And I was thinking about it as we were discussing it, is that the healthier we get, the more optimal we feel, the more connected to our environment and to the others around us, then we make those better decisions for the whole, not just for the personal. And it's
100%.
just we have more of an opportunity to do better.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, I think like selfishness is one of the things that human beings are accused of. But again, you're selfish when you're in a survival mode, and it's natural and it makes sense. If you feel like you're struggling to survive, you do not have time to think about others. Occasionally you do, because there's this kind of concept of displaced empathy. Like some people will, it's kind of that echo type that I talked about earlier. So it's a narcissist only care about themselves, don't care about anyone else. Echoes are kind of the opposite. They don't care about themselves. They only care about other people in some ways. So admittedly, that does happen. And that's not healthy either. But the more common thing is when you're really in survival mode, it's like what matters is me and maybe mine, my close family or whatever, and screw anyone else. I don't care about anyone else. So, but on the other hand, when you feel healthy and when you feel happy, you care about everyone. You care about everyone around you. You're not selfish. You're much more likely to contribute. You're much more likely to give. You're much more likely to be patient and compassionate and all that other stuff as well. So, yeah, I 100% agree, Chrissy.
Well, this has been really lovely. I love it when we get together and you bring these ideas and we have these discussions. And as well, because it's also about getting ourselves to the next level, not just us, yes, us in that way, but everybody. Because Just the fact of the matter is, this what I just sometimes I don't understand that people don't grasp is we need everybody else to be fit, well, and healthy because we can't do it all ourselves. So don't you want that person that's driving the train or flying their airplane or that other service that you're using to be in the best possible mental capacity, shape, and everything else?
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah,
unless
and your government, like you say, making those decisions for you.
unless you're depressed and really kind of deep down wish that everything would come to an end, and I think that
Then you're
is what
great.
a lot of it is about. Yeah, then it all
Yeah.
makes sense, right? Uh, so I think it's a big one, and I think maybe we'll do another episode like fully on depression because I think it is a big thing. But not in the narrow version of depression, but in the broadest sense of depression. So in what we're saying now, right, not being pro-human, not being pro the betterment and the evolution of yourself and your own species and the people around you. I think that's a more subtle form of depression, which is ultimately just a health, a sign of ill health. So it always all comes down to health. But you're right. I mean, everything you say is right, but of course, it all presupposes that you want to live, you want to be happy, you want to be successful, you want to evolve, whatever. And if you just given up on all that, then I guess it makes sense that you don't mind if everyone else around you is sick and can't think clearly and can't not competent to do what they're meant to be doing and all the rest of it. So yeah, the fact that you feel that way and you can't understand why other people wouldn't is a sign of health on your part, Chrissy.
Woo. Oh, beautiful. Well, are there any other final thoughts before we close this episode?
Yeah, share your thoughts on this. I know this is a bit more philosophical-ish, but I think it's not. As I said, the practical application of this for those listening is to understand other people around them. It's very easy, especially if you're well into the terrain theory, to just think that the people who are the opposite end are crazy, and I guess vice versa as well. And so I think it's important to understand everyone's point of view so you can talk to them in a way that's the most likely to be effective. And so I hope that this episode, even if you already kind of knew everything that I was saying, it's helped you to understand the other side's point of view better and to communicate with them in a way that perhaps is more effective. Because as you said, like, Chrissy, it's not the other reason, I guess, why you wouldn't want other people to be doing well other than if you're just generally depressed, is that you're in another. So depression kind of relates to that dorsal vagal state where you're kind of partly shut down. But the other option is you might be in that sympathetic state where you feel like life is a war, and so then you feel like the other, that's the other side. Like, okay, so I want me and my people to be healthy, but the enemy, I'd be happy if they, are not. That's the kind of idea. And so I agree with you that we need to not think of things in that way because. And I understand it's tempting to, especially if you've been very hurt by people. Like I know, for instance, the people who are demonizing you during COVID for not following along with the program and they didn't let you spend time with your mother as they're dying and they fired you from your job and, whatever. It's very difficult. And I'm not saying you should just forgive and turn the other cheek. But what I am saying is, look, even if you could drop a nuclear bomb and wipe all those people out, you still wouldn't have resolved the problem because the problem is an attitude or a mindset. It's not a group of people. And so if you were able to be like Thanos and snap your finger and have all these people go out of existence, there would still be people who would end up doing that stuff to you because it's a way of thinking that other people who are still around you would get into. So the answer is not to see it in terms of, other people, the enemy, and we need to destroy the enemy. The way to see it is we need to convert them, we need to win them over, we need and help them, right? Help them to see sense, help them to see that diminishing other people, enslaving other people, terrorizing other people, controlling other people, all the rest of it. Not only are these things not okay, but they're actually, as you just said, Chrissy, counterproductive. They're not helping them, right? A lot of the time, the reason that people want to control you and get revenge on you and make you conform and all the rest of it, all the things that might be upsetting to some of the kind of people who watch this, is because they feel insecure inside. They feel a lack of, control in themselves. They feel a lot of lack of self-worth, all that kind of stuff. And that in turn often relates to health issues again. Maybe it's some kind of nutritional deficiencies. Maybe it's some kind of toxicity, etc. The whole list. So I guess what I'm saying is that the vast majority of people anyway, if you help them, they will get to a place where they are actually pleasant to be around and you don't have to fight them anymore. There is a very small percentage, admittedly, who are born predatory that we've talked about before, and they will always be a problem. And so if you identify, maybe 1 or 2 out of 100 people like that, fair enough. But if you're feeling like 50% of the population is your enemy, then you've missed something. It's not the case. Most of them are, misguided maybe, and maybe you're misguided about some stuff as well, right? Maybe I'm misguided about stuff. Maybe we all are. And so, have a conversation. Maybe they can help you see where you're misguided. Maybe you can help them see where they're misguided. I think that's really the key.
Absolutely. Well said, Elwin. And again, lovely listeners, thank you for joining us. Please make sure that you leave those comments below, hit the bell icon so you don't miss an episode, and we'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed that, I recommend watching our latest episode, which you can do by clicking above. And make sure to subscribe, like the video, comment, and share with anyone who you think might appreciate it. Thank you.